forward in our Big Ten carousel, we got the Iowa Hawkeyes, who I've been really looking forward to talking about in general. I'm a huge Kirk Ferentz fan. I know a lot of Iowa fans will give me shit for that because they've dealt with him for the past 30 years and, quite frankly, probably over him, which I totally understand. But, as I kind of evaluate Iowa football and I ask myself, where do they go from here? How do they move forward? And what would another season under Kirk Ferentz be like? There's a couple different avenues that go in my head. I think first and foremost, for the people who may not watch Iowa as much, in many ways, Iowa football has been the pillar of consistency in terms of winning at the FBS level. I mean, if you look at their past even 20 years, let's say, I mean, they have not had any less than 8 wins since for the past decade or so. So to have that much consistency over that period of time is something that I think gets swept under the rug a lot, mainly because of Ferentz in general. And you could talk about some of the hijinks, let's say, that he had in the early 2010s and the whole athletic trainer Doyle issue, which I'm not going to get into too much. But you look at there and you say to yourself, hey, he hasn't had a losing season since 2012. Since 2014, he's had at least 8 wins every single season. And for the most part, you can sit there and criticize some of his coordinator hires. I'll be the first one to sit there and tell you I'm not in love with Tim Lester. But at the same time, he does have that experience in Western Michigan. He does understand what it's like to recruit within the Midwest footprint. And, most importantly, I think one of the big questions you have with Iowa too is, can anybody on that coaching staff really coach quarterbacks? Could you sit there and say to yourself, man, you brought in a guy like Cade McNamara who they thought was going to be the answer. And then you go back, I mean, the last quarterbacks I really remember being any sort of, really fun to watch was Ricky. I remember watching Ricky Stanzi back in the late 2009, 2010 era. Then I sit there and say to myself, a lot of the other quarterbacks that they've had are really just, quite frankly, not that memorable. And you sit there and say to yourself, okay, some quarterbacks don't pan out for one reason or another. Maybe the schooling's not going well, or maybe they're just don't like it. But after a while, when you get to a point, whether it's talking about Brian Ferentz being coordinator, you talk about Tim Lester, or you talk about anybody else, the real reality is that no matter what coaching staff they've had, they've just had a complete ineptitude at coaching quarterbacks. You get to a point too where you say to yourself, hey, there's nothing wrong with running the zone read scheme. I think it can still work in college football, even though that some of the rules in general have kind of changed to the extent that it may not be as beneficial or as strong as it used to be. However, you do sit there and say to yourself, Iowa has done a great job at particularly recruiting on the offensive line. They consistently have had some of the top linebackers in all of the Big Ten, if not the entire country. I mean, you sit there, I think of Nick Jackson. I think of Nate Higgins, and even Sebastian Castro, who's another corner, and Quinn Shalut too. You think of those guys, you say to yourself, hey, those guys can be the foundation of any defense in the country. So, they definitely deserve some credit there. And even when you reflect back and look at this 2024 schedule here, Iowa, obviously the loss to week 2 versus Iowa State could have been a game that definitely could have shake some heads in terms of if they got that one. Really strong wins versus Minnesota, Washington, Northwestern, and Wisconsin, which often I think gets swept under the rug too. And then, of course, taking care of business in the last week of the year versus Nebraska too. Another 13-10 victory, very similar to what we saw last year versus them too, except this year was a fumble, whereas the year before it was an interception. But moving forward here, you kind of say to yourself, I was in that sort of pillar where you can pretty much almost guarantee at least 8 wins from them every season. But again, the question from them is, can the way that Kirk Ferentz coaches, recruits, his message, and all that in general, are those things that can necessarily get them past that sort of echelon where they are competing for Big Ten titles? They would be in a college football playoff and whatnot too. I mean, even in 2023, they made an appearance too. So it's not like they're that far off or anything. It's more or less how can Kirk Ferentz change? And from everything that I've seen this year, I don't think it's not that he necessarily doesn't believe in changing. I just don't think he's going to. And it's just like anything else. When you've coached college football for 20 or 30 years or so, and you've seen everything, and he's beloved there for many reasons. I would say that Iowa's also the one of the best programs in all of college football to be able to watch a game. I still get the chills every time I see the wave to the Children's Hospital. That's always a feel good moment for me. But you sit there and they're 8-4 this season. They have Caleb Johnson, who's in his junior year, rushed for over 1,500 yards, but 21 touchdown passes. Not too involved in the passing attack, but again, they do great at coaching the offensive line. They get enough pressure on the defensive front. I think they could be a little bit better with that. Maybe get a couple more edge rushers in there in terms of the recruiting front, but in general, they never really been too big believers in the transfer portal. They had one of the least amount of transfers in all college football, with only 3 going into the 2024 season. But you sit there and say to yourself, man, they play Missouri in the Music City Bowl, which I think for one's going to be really an exciting game, because I think in many ways they both kind of have that blue collar, gritty sort of attitude and mentality where it's going to be fought in the trenches. The offensive lines are going to be going hard, and quite frankly, I think both those teams are in very similar circumstances when it comes to their overall long-term longevity in terms of being in that consistent 7 to 10 win pillar, but not necessarily one of those teams where you sit there and say to yourself, hey, these guys are going to be national championship contenders in a couple seasons if you're missing blank, blank, and blank. I think with Iowa, it's a little bit, the roots are a little bit more elongated in the sense of, for one, you're stuck with Kirk Ferentz as your head coach, because back when he signed that extension in 2016, that was all the way through 2026. So you have to imagine to sit there and say to yourself, okay, he probably has 2 more seasons left and then it's going to retire. That's probably where you're kind of looking at it. So I'm kind of looking at the Iowa program within the context of having 2 years left in order to be able to make the most of it. I mean, I love Kirk Ferentz. I think he's a phenomenal coach. I think he's changed the lives of thousands of football players in this country, and I think, quite frankly, he's underrated and doesn't get enough credit. I think when people look back at him, I think people are looking at him more fondly, but I think you're kind of at that point, almost to the point where you're just kind of sick and tired of him. But at the same time, you sit there and say to yourself, who else out there are they going to get to that would be able to replace his type of statue, his type of legacy too? And then on top of that too, I mean, there definitely are some serious questions on the offensive side of the ball, and it feels like it's the same sort of echo chamber year after year after year. I mean, when you look at their quarterback room, I mean, Cade McNamara was supposed to be kind of the guy to be able to put this all together, but between the injury problems and, quite frankly, the offensive staff being almost too patient with him, it got to the point by the time they moved on to Brandon Sullivan, by the time you got to that point, you sat there and said to yourself, man, they just struggled so much to the point where they never felt comfortable in there. The defenses were able to kind of pick up on what they were doing. It's very kind of conservative play, not too many deep shots, pretty sort of backyard, sort of elementary type of offense too. And then when you sit there and say to yourself, hey, your best wide receiver only has 382 reception yards on the year, and pretty much in nowhere in between of being able to break tackles or do anything like that too, it just leaves you scratching your head every year, because you say to yourself, man, you have this rock star defense here. You have some of the best linebackers in the country, corners who can cover almost any receiver in the Big Ten. Why aren't they competing for Big Ten championships every year? And the answer is twofold, right? I think first and foremost, I don't think Kirk Ferentz has changed enough on the offensive side of the ball. Now, I'm not saying he necessarily has to step aside. I don't think that's necessarily the solution. But you got to get to a point where if he really wants to have one more legit Big Ten championship run and be able to make appearance in the college football playoff, that whole thing needs to change too. But at the same time, it's hard to sit there and get excited when Tim Lester is your offensive coordinator. And nothing against him. It's just, he's just not the most exciting coordinator. I mean, you kind of know what you're going to get from him. And yes, he's coached some quarterbacks in the past, and yes, he has a lot of offensive experience. I mean, I even thought he was going to be a candidate for the North Carolina job. But at the same time, you sit there and say to yourself, there has to be a point where you're, in many ways, they are kind of stuck with him, right? But at the same time, you are going to get to a point where there's nothing wrong with Iowa sticking with the zone blocking scheme. That's okay and everything. But at the same time, you have to get to a point where maybe you build in some play action stuff. Maybe you can get this offensive line to be, a little bit stronger, particularly in pass protection. But at the same time, too, I mean, I think the quarterback room is such a big question this year. Now, obviously, Kirk Ferentz is going to say, yeah, you got the right future. Stratton's interesting. Brandon Sullivan's interesting, whatever. And they did bring in Hank Brown from Auburn, which I think is an underrated move. I think for people that have watched Auburn, yeah, people are going to stick on, well, he threw this many interceptions and he did this, and this wrong, and his mechanics were all screwed up or whatever. But when push comes to shove, I mean, he is a solid young kid. And do I think Iowa can make it work with him? Possibly. Do I think he could definitely be flirting with the starting job? Certainly. If I went into the year with Hank Brown as my starter, would I be a little nervous? Absolutely would I be a little nervous. But at the same time, being able to throw yourself into the fire of the SEC and having a coach like Hugh Freeze be able to trust you in that spot after the whole Payne Thorne thing kind of fizzled out, it definitely makes you wonder. But at the same time, I do think to some extent that the ceiling has been reached with Kurt Ferentz and Iowa. I mean, obviously, I hope it doesn't, because I do think he is one of my favorite coaches in all of college football. But at the same time, too, when you have so much strength on the defensive of the ball and you have so much ineptitude on the offensive side of the ball without being able to develop quarterbacks, having a running back here and there who has those 1,200 to 1,500 rushing yards, but at the same time, too, you can't have a guy like that carrying you every single year. And when you have a an offense that hasn't really changed in 30 years, you just have to get to a point where you're able to grow and develop. And you just kind of wonder if you're ever going to be able to see that again from this Iowa Hawkeyes team under Kirk Ferentz.